I have been documenting abandoned homesteads in the Blue Ridge for 11 years, which is long enough to have developed the specific professional relationship with emptiness that this work requires. The homesteads I document are not empty in the way of a cleared and clean space. They are empty in the way of places that were full and then suddenly were not, where the fullness stopped at a specific moment and has been held in suspension ever since by the combination of structural integrity and the absence of human disturbance. I have been in houses where the calendar on the wall still shows the month the family left. I have been in houses where the dishes are stacked in the cabinet in the order someone put them there 60 years ago, and the order has not changed. I have been in houses where the beds are made in the specific way of someone who made beds carefully, because that was how you were raised and you did not stop doing it even when there was no one to see whether you had done it. I have been in these houses many times, and I have developed the professional capacity to observe them accurately and document them completely, and to understand what I am seeing as evidence of lives rather than as something else. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that I am not a person who makes mistakes of observation or who imports meaning into things that do not have meaning. I am a trained documenter. What I found in the Hensley homestead in Mitchell County was what I found, and I am going to describe it as accurately as I can. The Hensley homestead was the fourth property on my assignment list for September. The assignment was part of a multi-year documentation project that my organization, a Blue Ridge heritage preservation nonprofit based in Spruce Pine, had been undertaking to create a comprehensive photographic and written record of abandoned homesteads in a defined region before further deterioration made documentation impossible. The Hensley property was on the list because it met the criteria: a homestead that had been occupied through at least the early 20th century, vacated within a defined historical window, and structurally intact enough to permit interior documentation. The county historical records showed that the Hensley property had been occupied last in 1952, when the final resident, an elderly woman named Celia Hensley, a widow in her 80s, had been taken by her daughter to live in a mill town in Burke County and had died there the following year. The property had been in the family's informal custody since then, without active management, and in 1987, the County Historical Society had conducted their own documentation project and had sealed the structure at the conclusion of it, boarding the windows and nailing the door in the specific way that preservation projects seal structures they are protecting from casual entry and weather damage. The seal had held. The county's records showed no authorized access to the property since 1987. My access permit had been issued by the County Historical Society after a formal request from my organization, and it authorized me to enter, document, and exit without disturbing the structure or its contents. I drove to the nearest accessible point on the county road on a Tuesday in the second week of September and hiked the remaining quarter-mile to the homestead on a path that was still visible as a path despite 37 years of recovery growth, the route of a path apparently being a more persistent thing in a mountain landscape than the clearing of it. The homestead came into view through the trees, as these homesteads always do. The structure's gray-weathered wood and the particular shape of an old mountain house assembling themselves from the forest context as you approach, and I had the response I always have at this moment, which is the response of recognizing a specific kind of survival, a house that has been here for a century or more and has not yet been reclaimed, and that you have been granted the privilege of entering. The door was nailed as the records indicated it would be. The nails were the square-headed nails of a 1987 seal, 3 of them through the door frame into the jamb at the top and the side, and I had brought the appropriate tools for removing them, and I removed them carefully and set them aside and pushed the door open and stepped in. The smell is always the first thing. The smell of a sealed structure is the smell of enclosed time, not decay, not mold in a healthy structure, but the specific compression of decades of ordinary domestic smell that has been contained without the ventilation of regular habitation, the smell of wood and fabric, and the particular organic component of dust that collects in a space where human activity has stopped. I have smelled this smell in perhaps 40 structures over my career, and it is not unpleasant, but it is unmistakable. The olfactory equivalent of reading a date on a document, it tells you immediately how long the space has been sealed. This smell told me 30 years at minimum. It was accurate. The interior of the Hensley homestead was what the records and the exterior had led me to expect. A main room that served as both sitting area and kitchen, which is the layout of the smallest of these mountain structures, where the single fireplace or wood stove serves both functions and the spatial organization follows the heat. A sleeping room through a door at the back. A loft accessible by a steep built-in ladder. The furniture was present: a table, 2 chairs, a dry sink, a small sideboard, all in the positions they had occupied when Celia Hensley had last been in them, all covered in the even gray dust of 37 sealed years. The boarded windows admitted thin lines and small points of light through the gaps in the boarding, the specific dim quality of interior illumination in a sealed structure. I turned on my work light, and I began my documentation. I photographed from the door first, the wide shot that establishes the full interior before you move into it, and then I moved through the standard documentation sequence, the systematic coverage of each wall, each piece of furniture, each significant detail: the wood stove, the dry sink with its remaining crockery, the sideboard with its small accumulated objects, a tin cup, a folded cloth, a small glass bottle whose label had deteriorated to illegibility, the floor showing the path of habitual movement worn into the wood planks, the path from door to stove to table in the specific wear pattern of a person who lived alone and walked the same routes for decades. I was doing the table section of the documentation when I saw the picture. It was on the table. The table was against the wall opposite the door, the position of the table in these small structures that puts it in the best light from the window that was now boarded, but which had been the reason for the table's position, the positioning that made sense when the window was clear, and no longer made the same sense but had never been changed, because you do not change where the table is simply because the light has changed. The pitcher was in the center of the table, a ceramic pitcher, the kind made in the mountain pottery tradition of that era, cracked along one side from the shoulder to the base in the way of ceramic that has been through temperature changes, the crack old and dark with age. The pitcher had been on this table for a very long time. The evidence for this was in the dust. There was a ring in the dust at the pitcher's base, the ring of an object that had been in the same position long enough for the dust to accumulate around it and define its presence as a permanent feature of the table's surface. The ring was old. The ring was the ring of a pitcher that had been sitting on this table for decades. The flowers in the pitcher were not old. I want to be precise about this in the way that my training requires me to be precise, because precision is the thing that separates documentation from impression, and I am a documenter. The flowers in the pitcher were fresh, not in the relative sense of less deteriorated than I might have expected, fresh in the absolute sense. Fresh in the sense that would have been fresh if I had found them in a vase on my own kitchen table that morning. The stems had been cut recently, the cut ends pale and clean rather than dried and darkened. The blooms were open and undamaged in the way of flowers that have not yet begun to wilt, the petals intact and flexible rather than brittle. The specific flowers, and I identified them because plant identification is part of my documentation. Training were a mix of ironweed and goldenrod, and a small aster variety, all of which were in bloom in that part of Mitchell County in the second week of September, all of which would have been available within a short walk of the homestead in that specific week. Someone had gathered flowers from the field and wood margins of this property in the last day or two and had put them in this pitcher on this table. I stood at the table for a moment before I photographed anything else, which is not my standard practice. My standard practice is continuous documentation without pausing for reflection during the active session. I stood at the table and I looked at the flowers, and I looked at the dust on the table, and I looked at the floor between the door and the table. The dust on the table was undisturbed, except for the ring around the pitcher's base, which was old, and there was no disturbance anywhere on the table's surface that would indicate something being moved to place the pitcher or the pitcher being lifted and replaced. The floor between the door and the table showed my footprints in the dust and nothing else. I turned and looked at the floor in all directions from the table. My footprints were the only footprints on the dusty floor. The windows were boarded. The door had been nailed when I arrived. I photographed the pitcher and the flowers. I photographed the table and the ring and the dust at the pitcher's base. I photographed the floor around the table. I photographed the windows in their boarded state and the door in its frame. I completed my full documentation of the interior in the standard sequence, and I photographed the sleeping room and the loft, and I noted all relevant details in my field notebook. I replaced the nails in the doorframe when I left, as the access protocol required, and I walked back to my car and drove back to Spruce Pine. I filed my report the following Thursday. The report covered the Hensley homestead in the standard format, the structural assessment, the contents inventory, the photographic record with image numbers, the historical context, the recommendations for future preservation. The flowers were not in the report. I made this decision consciously, and I have thought about it many times since. I did not include the flowers because I could not include them in a way that the report's format and purpose accommodated. The report is a document of historical and structural fact. The flowers were a fact, but not a historical or structural one, and the category they occupied, fresh wildflowers in a sealed structure, undisturbed dust, no footprints, windows boarded, door nailed, was not a category that my report format contained. I have told two people, a colleague at my organization who has been doing this work longer than I have, to whom I described what I found and showed the photographs, and who was quiet for a long time before she said that she had been in a structure in Avery County 7 years ago where something similar had happened, and that she had also left it out of her report. And the woman at the County Historical Society who manages the access permits, whom I asked about the Hensley homestead's access history, whether anyone had been in since the 1987 seal. She checked the records and said no. I asked if there was any way someone could have accessed the structure without going through the permit process. She said the permit process was the access process, and that there was no other authorized mechanism. I thanked her and left. I have the photographs. The photographs show what I described, the picture in its ring of old dust, the fresh flowers, the undisturbed floor, the boarded windows. I have looked at them many times. The flowers in the photographs are unambiguously fresh. The dust around the picture's base is unambiguously old. These two things are both true in the same photograph, and I have not found a framework for holding them together that satisfies me, and I have stopped looking for one. I retired from the Appalachian Studies faculty at Appalachian State University 4 years ago after 31 years of teaching, and the retirement has not produced the withdrawal from the field that some of my colleagues predicted it would. What it has produced is the freedom to pursue the specific projects that the demands of teaching and administration and academic publication had always pushed to the margins of my attention, the sustained, unhurried, primary source documentation work that academic schedules rarely accommodate and that I had been deferring for the better part of 2 decades in favor of the work that the institution required. The log cabin above Elk Creek in Watauga County was one of those deferred projects. I had known about it since the early 2000s, when a graduate student of mine had mentioned it in passing while working on a thesis about vernacular log construction in the North Carolina high country, and I had been trying to access it ever since with the intermittent persistence of someone who knows a thing is worth doing and has not yet found the conditions to do it. The obstacle for most of those years was the ownership situation. The property, 17 acres in a remote section of Watauga County, the cabin sitting on the upper portion of the acreage, above a creek drainage that gives the property its character, had passed out of the Presnell family through a process that is common with these old mountain properties, the original family dispersing across generations, until the deed ended up with a branch of the family in Ohio, who had never seen the land and had no particular connection to it beyond legal ownership and a vague awareness of its existence. I had found the Ohio family through the county deed records after several years of searching and had written to them 4 times before I reached a person who understood what I was asking and agreed to grant access in writing. The permission came in August, and I drove up to Watauga County in the 2nd week of September, which is the right time of year for this kind of work. The air clear, the snakes less active, the access conditions as good as they will be before the fall. Hunting seasons complicate matters. I want to describe the drive-in because the drive-in is part of the experience, and because the experience is what I am trying to document accurately. The county road that approaches the property is maintained but narrow, and the track that leaves it to follow the creek drainage up to the cabin is not maintained at all. It is a track in the sense of a route that has been driven enough times in the past to leave a mark that is still visible as a mark, but not in the sense of something you can drive a standard vehicle on. I parked where the track became impassable and walked the remaining 1.5 miles, which took me 40 minutes carrying my equipment. The creek was on my right for most of the walk, running low at that time of year over the specific rounded stones of a Blue Ridge Creek that has been making its own channel for a long time. The forest on both sides was the mixed hardwood and hemlock of a north-facing slope that has not been cut in many decades. The canopy high and the understory relatively open, the light coming through in the specific quality of filtered September light that makes these mountain hollows look exactly as they should look if you know what you are looking at. The cabin came into view at a turn in the track where the drainage widened slightly and the canopy opened enough to let the sky in. I have been to many of these structures, and I find that the first sight of them never quite loses its quality of impact. The survival of these buildings in their context is always slightly surprising, despite the fact that you have come specifically to document their survival. The Presnell cabin was a 2-pen log structure of the type common in this part of the county in the 19th century. The logs hewn and fitted with the specific craftsmanship of an era when this kind of construction was the natural expression of available materials and available skills. It had a central chimney, the stone of it still intact and standing, which told me something about the quality of the original construction. The door was nailed as my correspondence with the Ohio family had confirmed it would be. They had told me their grandparents had sealed it when Nora Presnell was taken to Tennessee in 1961, and that as far as they knew it had not been opened since. I had brought appropriate tools for removing the seal, and I removed the nails from the door frame with the care of someone who intends to replace them when they leave, which I did intend, and which I did. The door swung inward with the specific resistance of a door that has been in the same position for 60 years, the hinges stiff but functional, the wood of the frame having swelled and settled around the door's dimensions in ways that made the fit tight. I pushed it fully open, and I stepped in, and I stood in the doorway for a moment while my eyes adjusted from the September outdoor light to the interior dimness. The smell of 60 sealed years is different from the smell of 37 sealed years, which I can tell you with the confidence of someone who has experienced both. It is not more intense, but it is more settled, more complete. The domestic component of the smell having been replaced more fully by the purely organic smell of old wood and old fabric and old dust, in a way that removes the last residue of human occupation and leaves something that smells more like the inside of a very old tree than the inside of a house. There is still something human in it, in the way that a space shaped for human habitation never entirely loses its human quality, but it is far back, receded, the way a voice sounds when heard from a very long distance. I stood in the doorway, and I let my eyes adjust, and I took in the smell, and then I moved in. The interior was intact in the way of the best preserved of these structures, the furniture present and in position, the objects of daily life in their places. The accumulated domestic arrangements of 60 years of single-occupant habitation, held in suspension by the sealed structure and the dry mountain air, a table and 2 chairs, a dry sink and above it a small shelf with dishes, a wood stove, its pipe intact, the stovepipe's connection to the chimney still sealed by the original sheet metal collar, a rope bed in the back pen, the rope still strung, a folded quilt on the ropes with the quilt's colors still present beneath the dust, in a way that told me the wool had been good quality when it was made, a small trunk against the wall, a ladder-back chair by the window with a worn cushion tied to the seat. The window was unboarded. This was a structure, sealed by door, rather than by the more comprehensive sealing that the 1,987 county project had done to the Hensley homestead. And the light came in through the original glass, dimmer than outdoor light and slightly distorted by the old glass's imperfections, the specific quality of light inside a cabin that has original panes. I documented from the door first. My standard practice, the wide-angle photograph that establishes the full interior context. And in the process of positioning the frame of that first photograph, I saw the mason jar on the table. It was a standard canning jar, the ball type that was produced in large quantities in the mid-20th century and that you find in virtually every homestead kitchen of this era, the glass with the slight blue-green tint of that period's manufacture. It was sitting on the table, which was the table positioned under the window in the front pen, the position of maximum available light. The jar had an inch of water in it. I could see the water level from where I was standing. the line of the water clearly visible against the glass. And in the jar, in the water, was a bunch of fresh mountain asters. I want to be precise about mountain asters, because they are identifiable and because the identification matters. Mountain asters in Watauga County bloom from late August through October at elevations above 3,000 feet, which is the elevation of this property. They are a small flowered aster, white to pale lavender, with yellow centers, and they grow in the disturbed margins and open areas of mountain properties, exactly the kind of plant that grows in the margins of an old, cleared homestead site, in the areas where the canopy is still open and the ground has been disturbed by decades of human use. They are also exactly the kind of flower that someone collecting a simple bunch of flowers from the immediate surroundings of a property would pick in September. The bunch in the jar contained perhaps 15 stems, the flowers fully open, the petals intact, the stems still clearly drawing water from the inch in the jar's bottom. The table around the jar showed the dust of 60 years on its surface, even undisturbed, the gray film that accumulates on horizontal surfaces in sealed structures over decades. Except for the ring. Under the jar, where the jar's base met the table surface, there was a ring of disturbed dust, not the ring of an object that had been in the same position long enough for the dust to establish itself around its base, but the ring of an object placed recently on a dusty surface. The dust displaced outward in the slight way that happens when something is set down on dust rather than sitting in it for decades. The jar had been placed on this table recently. The flowers in it were fresh. I photographed everything before I moved or touched anything. I am a careful documenter even in retirement, and the care has become habitual over 30 years. I photographed the jar and the flowers. I photographed the ring of disturbed dust. I photographed the floor between the door and the table, and then the floor throughout the rest of the interior. The floor showed the dust and debris of 60 years of no human passage. It showed my own footprints, clearly, the impression of my boots in the accumulated material on the floor, and it showed nothing else. Whatever had placed the flowers on the table had not walked in through the door and across the floor in a way that left footprints in the dust. I sat in the ladder-back chair by the window for a long time after I completed the documentation. I sat in Nora Presnell's chair, and I looked at the fresh flowers in the mason jar on the table, and I listened to the sounds of the Elk Creek drainage outside the window, the water over stone, the wind in the hemlock canopy, the birds of the September mountain hollow, and I thought about a woman who had lived in this specific place for however many decades, and had been taken from it at the end of her life to go and die somewhere else. And I thought about the flowers and what their presence in the sealed cabin meant if I was not willing to accept the explanations that offered themselves, which were a neighbor who had accessed the structure without authorization and had left no footprints, or an animal who had carried fresh asters into a nailed structure and placed them in a jar with water, or something else entirely that I was not, in the September light of that mountain hollow, ready to name. I drove back to Boone, and I called the Ohio family that evening. I reached the great-granddaughter who had handled the access permission, a woman in her 40s, efficient and pleasant in our previous communications. I asked her when the family had last visited the property. She said never, that none of them had ever been to North Carolina and that the property was something they were aware of but had never engaged with beyond the legal minimum. I asked her if she had given access to anyone else, a researcher, a neighbor, anyone. She said no. I asked her if she would tell me anything about Nora Presnell that she thought was relevant to my research. She said her grandmother had talked about Nora, that Nora was a great-grandmother she had never met but whose memory had been kept in the family through stories. I asked if there was anything specific she remembered. There was a pause. Then she said her grandmother had told her that Nora put fresh flowers on her table every morning of her life. She said it had been one of the specific details that had survived, not the general picture of the woman, but this particular habit, the way specific habits sometimes survive in family memory when general portraits fade. She said Nora had told her grandchildren that a house without flowers was not properly alive, and that as long as she was able, she had kept flowers on the table. She said the grandchildren had found it difficult when they came to take her to Tennessee in 1961 because Nora had kept asking about her flowers, whether someone would keep flowers on the table, and they had not known what to tell her. I thanked her, and we ended the call. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my motel in Boone, and I thought about an old woman asking whether someone would keep flowers on her table, and about a mason jar with an inch of water and fresh mountain asters in a sealed cabin on a Watauga County hillside, and about the ring of recently disturbed dust on a surface that had not been disturbed for 60 years, and about the floor with no footprints but mine. And I find that I am still thinking about all of these things in the months since that September afternoon. And I find that I have not arrived at a conclusion I am comfortable with. And I find that I do not expect to. My wife Laurel found the Avery County property, and I will tell you that finding it was the thing she was best at in the years we spent looking, which was 2.5 years of weekends spent driving the mountain roads of western North Carolina, looking for the specific thing we had been describing to each other and to real estate agents, and to anyone who asked what we were looking for, which was a house with a view. Not a house near a view. Not a house with a view available from a specific window if you stood at the right angle. A house from which the view was the primary fact of the property, the thing the house had been built to serve, the reason the house was in the particular place it occupied. We had been living in Charlotte for 11 years, and Laurel had been saying for 7 of those 11 that what she needed, not wanted but needed, was to be able to see the horizon from where she lived, to have the view be part of the daily experience of the house, rather than something you drove to on weekends. The Avery County Victorian was the house. I want to describe the view before I describe anything else about the property, because the view is necessary to understanding everything that follows. The house sits on the side of a ridge in the eastern part of Avery County, at an elevation that gives it a sightline down a long valley between 2 parallel ridges. The valley visible for perhaps 12 miles from the front porch, before the ridges close together at the far end, and the view terminates in the specific blue haze that distant Appalachian mountains produce in every season. In October, when we first saw the property, the valley was in full color from ridge to ridge, and standing on the front porch of the house, I understood immediately and completely why someone had built a house in this specific location, on this specific slope, at this specific elevation. The house had been built to hold the view. Every design decision the original builders had made was oriented toward the front of the house and the porch and the valley below. The property had been foreclosed after its owner, a woman named Cora Hensley, had been placed in a memory care facility following a decline in her condition that her neighbors and the county social services had managed jointly, there being no immediate family to take over the arrangement. She was 89. She had lived in the house for 62 years. The foreclosure had proceeded when it became clear that she would not return to the property and that there was no family to manage the estate and no financial mechanism to maintain the mortgage. The bank had done a clearance of the property's contents standard procedure and had listed it at a price that reflected the foreclosure circumstances rather than the market value that the property's condition and location would command. When we arrived for our first visit with the listing agent, the bank's representative met us at the house to walk through the clearance status. She was apologetic before she said anything specific, which is the manner of someone who has already identified a problem and is managing the delivery of it. She said the clearance team had done a full pass and had removed everything, but that there was one item that appeared to have been missed. She gestured toward the front porch. On the porch, centered, positioned to face the valley, was a rocking chair. It was a handmade chair, not from a craftsman in the formal sense, but from a person with the skills and the patience to make a thing well and for a specific purpose. The wood was black walnut, darkened further by years of exposure to the porch's weather, and the proportions were the proportions of a chair made for a specific person's body and a specific orientation. The seat height and the angle of the back and the length of the rockers, all suggesting a chair built to put its occupant at a specific eye level relative to a specific view. The chair faced the valley. It had been built to face the valley, and it was facing the valley. And it had been there long enough that the porch boards under the rockers showed the shallow, curved grooves of 60 years of use, the wood worn to the specific shape of this chair's particular arc. The bank's representative said the clearance team could come back for it. Laurel said no. She said it was a beautiful chair, and she was keeping it, and the bank's representative noted this on her paperwork, and we moved on to the walkthrough. The house was everything the listing had promised, and the view was what we had been looking for, and we made our offer the following week and closed in December. We moved in on a Saturday in January, which in Avery County means cold and clear, to the valley, visible all the way to its far terminus, in the specific winter clarity that strip-mode deciduous ridges produce when the leaves are down and the air is cold, and there is nothing between the eye and the distance. Laurel stood on the porch for 20 minutes after the movers left, in her coat, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, looking at the valley. I stood beside her for some of it, and left her to it for the rest, which is what you do when someone is receiving what they have been waiting for. The rocking chair was between us and the railing, the chair positioned as it had been when we found it, and Laurel sat in it for a few minutes. And I could see from her expression that the proportions were right. For the view, the chair put her at exactly the eye level that the view required, the angle of her gaze when she sat in it, the angle that took in the full length of the valley from the ridge closure at the far end to the nearer sections where the farms and the lower roads were visible. We were busy the first week with the unpacking and the establishing of new routines, and I was not paying attention to the chair in any particular way. It was Laurel who noticed. She mentioned it on the 5th morning, over breakfast, in the way you mentioned something you have been noticing for a few days and are not yet sure whether to characterize as significant. She said she thought the chair had moved. I asked what she meant. She said the angle was different, that it had been facing slightly more to the right than it was facing now, that the orientation had shifted overnight. I said the wind maybe, that rockers on a flat porch surface can be moved by wind pressure on the chair's back. She said maybe. By the end of the 2nd week, she had been noting it consistently enough that we both acknowledged the pattern. The chair's orientation was not constant. It shifted not dramatically, not turning 90 degrees, but the small angular shifts of a person adjusting their seat to follow something specific in the field of view, the kind of micro-adjustments that someone makes when they are watching the light change in a valley across the course of seasons and are positioning themselves each time to see the particular element that is most interesting on a given morning. On a morning when the low fog was in the valley bottom, the chair was angled down. On a morning when the light was on the far ridge, the chair was angled up and right. I measured this. I measured the chair's position relative to the porch railing on a dozen mornings and recorded the measurements and plotted them, and the pattern was the pattern of someone watching the valley with sustained attention and adjusting their angle of observation as the view changed. Laurel said she wanted to ask about Cora Hensley. I said that was reasonable. We called the memory care facility, the one listed in the county's records of the foreclosure proceedings, and spoke with a staff member named Kay, who had the careful phone manner of someone who is accustomed to receiving calls about residents from people with complicated relationships to those residents, which in this case was a couple who owned the woman's house and were calling about a rocking chair. Kay listened to what Laurel described and was quiet for a moment, and then said something that I want to reproduce as precisely as I can, because the precision matters. She said that Cora Hensley asked about her chair every day. She said every day, not most days, not often. Every day, she said Cora asked whether her chair was still on the porch, and whether the view from the chair was still good, and whether whoever was in the house now was taking care of the house and looking after the view. Kay said the doctors believed Cora was experiencing confusion associated with her condition, which produces this kind of persistent referential concern about objects and places from the person's past. Laurel asked if Cora had said anything specific about the chair, what it meant to her. Kay was quiet again for a moment, and then said that Cora had told her, on a day when she had been more articulate than usual, that she had sat in that chair every morning of her life on that porch for 60 years and that she wasn't done yet, and that leaving the chair behind was the thing that troubled her most about where she was now. Laurel was quiet on the drive home from the errand we had been running when we made the call. I was driving and she was looking out the passenger window at the mountains, and I could see her processing what Kay had said, and I did not interrupt the processing. When we got home, she went directly to the porch and she sat in the chair for a few minutes and looked at the valley, and then she came inside. She said she thought we should leave the chair where it was. I said I thought so too. We have not moved the chair. We have not attempted to determine the mechanism of its movement. The measurements I took are in a notebook on my desk, and I have not added to them because adding to them began to feel like the wrong kind of attention to give to something that is not our business. Cora Hensley is 90 now, based on what the records showed. She is in the memory care facility, and she asks about her chair every day, and the doctors believe she is confused. On mornings when the view is particularly good, when the fog is in the valley in the specific way it gets in March, or when the light on the far ridge is doing what October light does on those ridges, I go to the front door, I look at the chair before I step out, and sometimes the angle of it has already changed from the day before, already adjusted for the morning's specific quality of light, and I stand in the doorway for a moment, and then I go back inside and let the morning be what it is. The chair knows where it is. The woman who made it hers for 60 years knows where her chair is. I think about Kay's voice on the phone saying she isn't done yet, and I think about Cora Hensley in a facility somewhere asking every single morning whether the view is still good from where the chair sits, and I find that I want to be able to answer that question for her honestly, which is that the view is still extraordinary, and that her chair is on the porch where she left it, and that whoever is in the house now is, in fact, taking care of it.